The desert stretched out before them like an endless ocean of ochre and gold, shimmering under the punishing glare of the midday sun. Heat rose in rippling waves from the cracked earth, distorting the distant ridges into mirages that beckoned and mocked in equal measure. A hawk drifted overhead, its cry carrying far and thin through the empty air. Clara Benton's throat was so dry it hurt to swallow. Her bonnet offered little relief from the sun, and each breath felt like inhaling from an oven. She kept her eyes low, scanning the ground as she trudged beside the wagon track, her skirt catching burrs and dust. They had been walking for hours since the last water stop, Charles insisting they press on to make camp before nightfall. Her husband walked several paces ahead. Tall, lean, and unsmiling, his shadow long against the desert floor. He rarely looked back at her anymore. Clara had stopped expecting the soft glances and words that had once made her heart flutter back in Ohio. Out here, the journey westward had worn his tenderness away like wind scouring stone. A sudden sound, a dry, rapid buzzing, snapped her attention to the side. Before her mind could process the warning, the rattlesnake struck. It happened fast. A flash of movement, the glint of scales, and then a searing pain lanced through her ankle. Clara gasped and stumbled, the world tilting as she fell to the ground. Dust filled her mouth as she tried to cry out. Her vision blurred with shock, but she could still make out the thick, coiled body of the snake as it slid away, Rattles still shivering in the heat. She clutched at her leg, heart pounding. Too small. Puncture wounds glistened just above her boot, the skin around them already swelling, angry, and red. A hot, throbbing ache spread upward with terrifying speed. Charles turned at the sound of her fall, his expression shifting from irritation to mild alarm, but not the fear or urgency she had expected. He walked back, crouched down beside her, and pulled her boot halfway off to inspect the bite. "It's bad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Charles, you have to—" "Hold still," he said sharply, cutting her off. His eyes flicked from the wound to the horizon, calculating. He didn't try to draw the venom or bind the wound. Instead, he let go of her foot and straightened. This far from camp, with no proper doctor. He let the thought hang. "You can't leave me here," she said, panic rising. He sighed. A heavy, exasperated sound, as though she'd misplaced something important rather than been poisoned. "Clara, be reasonable. Even if I carried you, we'd lose daylight. The wagon's ahead. The others. They won't wait. They won't wait?" Her voice cracked. "I'm your wife. That's why I'm telling you the truth," he said, and for a moment, she thought she saw something almost like pity in his eyes. Almost. "You'll probably be gone by morning. The sun's too high to try for shade now. I'll ride ahead, tell someone where to find you." The words didn't register at first. She sat there, hands in the dust, watching him unstrap the canteen from his shoulder. He took a deep drink, then, without offering it to her, fastened it to his. "Saddle." "Charles," she said again, more faintly now. The swelling was worse. Her ankle felt like it was being squeezed in an iron vise, and the throbbing had climbed into her calf. But he was already mounting his horse. "I'll come back if I can," he said, avoiding her eyes. "If not," he let the sentence die. Then he turned the horse and spurred forward, the hoofbeats fading into the heavy, buzzing silence of the desert. Clara sat still for a long time, staring at the tracks in the dust where he had stood. Her body felt strangely distant, her heartbeat loud in her ears. The sunlight seemed brighter, harsher dot around her, the desert pressed in with its quiet menace. A black beetle trundled past her knee, oblivious. Somewhere far off, the hawk cried. Again. She thought about trying to crawl toward the nearest shadow, just a scraggly mesquite tree, maybe 30 yards away, but her arms trembled when she tried to push herself up. The venom was doing its work. Her tongue felt heavy, her breath shallow. She lay back slowly, the sky filling her vision. White clouds drifted lazily, mocking her stillness. Her last clear thought before the dizziness claimed her was not of Charles, but of her father's orchard. Back home, cool shade under apple blossoms, the hum of bees, the smell of damp earth. Then the light faded, and the desert swallowed her in its heat and silence. When Clara surfaced from the fog, she thought for a moment that Charles must have returned. A shadow leaned over her, blotting out the sun. But when she blinked against the light, the shadow was only a vulture circling lower than before, its wings wide and silent. She tried to call out, but the sound that left her throat was no louder than a sigh. The swelling in her leg had spread, her calf was stiff, the skin stretched taut, the pain sharp when she moved. Her mouth was so dry it felt cracked inside. The tracks Charles had left in the dust still pointed east toward the hills. She turned her head, straining for any sign of him. A glint of sunlight on a buckle, a trail of dust from his horse. Nothing. Slowly the truth hardened in her mind. He wasn't coming back. Not with help. Not at all. Charles had always been a man who measured people by their usefulness, though Clara had once mistaken that for ambition. In Ohio, when they had courted, he'd been charming, attentive until the papers were signed. The move west had stripped away the rest. Every mile seemed to narrow his patience, turn his words sharper, his eyes colder. And now, when her life balanced on a knife's edge, he decided she was no more than a burden. The thought burned hotter than the sun. She tried to remember what she knew of snake bites. Her grandmother had once told her never to cut the wound, never to drink liquor, and to keep the lens still. But her grandmother's voice was just a faint echo now, buried under the pounding in her skull. The rattlesnake's warning still rang in her ears like an unending threat. Her mind clung to one detail. Charles had taken the canteen. That was the moment she knew his words about sending help were a lie. If he truly meant to return, he would have left her water. A dry wind gusted, and the sand stung her cheeks. She turned her face away and saw her own shadow sprawled in the dust, small, fragile, almost already fading into the earth. Not like this, she murmured, surprised at her own voice, low and hoarse. She thought about trying to crawl again, but when she shifted, fire shot through her leg. A wave of dizziness followed, black spots dancing at the edge of her sight. The world tilted and swayed. Somewhere far away, she thought she heard hoofbeats, but then the sound faded, swallowed by the sigh of the wind. The desert seemed to grow larger, more oppressive. Every bush, every cactus stood like a silent witness to her abandonment. A place this vast didn't care if a person lived or died. The vultures certainly didn't. They just kept their distance, waiting, patient as the rocks her anger and her fear tangled together. She thought of the life Charles had promised her, a fine house out west, a thriving farm, a fresh start. All of it had been smoke, and she had followed him into this empty furnace of a land without seeing the trap. Now the trap was closing. She lay back again, her head heavy, the heat pressing down like a weight. Her lips cracked as she breathed shallowly, and the edges of the sky began to dim. Still, the thought clung stubbornly to her. If she was going to die here, she wanted it to be on her own terms, not as the discarded burden of a man who had deemed her unworthy of the effort. She wasn't sure how long she lay there after that. The sun inched westward, the light softening toward gold. The vultures kept their vigil, and in the shimmering distance, movement stirred different from the lazy wheeling of birds or the slither of a snake. A human shape walking with a steady, purposeful stride. For a heartbeat, hope flared so unexpected it almost hurt, but it was not Charles. At first, Clara wasn't sure if the figure was real. The heat shimmer made it waver one moment tall and solid, the next dissolving into the air like a mirage. She blinked hard, and when her vision cleared again, the shape was closer, moving. With a deliberate, unhurried gait, the stranger's steps were measured, almost silent against the sand. No horse, no wagon. Just a lone figure cutting across the desert with the ease of someone who belonged to it. Her heart thudded weakly in her chest, not entirely from hope, but from a strange wariness. The Arizona Territory had taught her quickly that rescue and danger sometimes wore the same face. She tried to call out, but her voice cracked into nothing. She coughed, the sound dry and painful. The motion made the world tilt, and black shadows swarmed her vision. When she opened her eyes again, the figure had drawn nearer. She could see now dark hair bound back, sun-browned skin, clothes of worn. Buckskin and cloth dyed with earth tones that blended into the desert itself. The stranger's eyes were fixed on her, not with curiosity, but with the steady, unreadable focus of a hunter who had spotted his quarry. Her breath caught not in fear exactly, but in the recognition that this person was not stumbling upon her by accident. He had seen her from a distance and chosen to approach. The swelling in her leg was worse now, the pain a dull, consuming throb. Her ankle looked distorted under the leather of her boot, the skin hot and stretched. Every heartbeat seemed to push the venom further through her veins. She wanted to stay awake, to see his face clearly, to understand who he was before darkness took her again. But her mind kept slipping sideways. The desert around her began to change in strange ways. The sound of the wind turned into the rustle of apple leaves in spring. The sky overhead became mottled with white blossoms instead of clouds. She thought she heard her father's voice calling her in for supper. Then it shifted again, Charles's voice, sharp and impatient, telling her to keep up, that she was slowing everything down. That one was easier to let go of. She let his words drift away into the empty air. The stranger was closer now, so close she could see the glint of a knife hilt at his belt, the leather worn smooth from years of use. He moved with the quiet of someone who knew how to place each footstep without waste. His shadow fell across her, a cool reprieve from the burning sun. She tried to lift her hand, to show she was still alive, but her arm felt like it belonged to someone else, heavy, slow, unresponsive. Her eyelids drooped, and for a moment she gave in to the dark. When she surfaced again, his knees were bent in front of her, his gaze steady and assessing. His expression gave away nothing, not pity, not disdain. The last thing she saw clearly before slipping under again was his hand reaching toward her ankle. His fingers were sure, steady, and warm against her skin. And then the desert faded. When Clara awoke again, the sun had shifted lower in the sky. The light softened to a burnished gold that painted the desert in long shadows. A faint breeze cooled her face, carrying with it a smell she couldn't place sharp. Earthy, tinged with something green. The stranger was still there. He sat cross-legged beside her, silent, a small bundle of plants laid out on a square of cloth before him. Some were dry and brittle, others fresh and fragrant despite the heat. She recognized none of them. His hair was long, black, and bound with a strip of leather. His skin was the deep sun-browned hue of someone who had lived his life under open skies. His eyes were dark, their gaze steady but not intrusive. He didn't stare, he simply watched, as though noting each rise and fall of her chest, each twitch of pain in her leg. When she tried to speak, the sound came out rough and weak. Water. Without a word, he reached for a small skin bag and tipped it carefully against her lips. The water was warm, but it was life. She swallowed greedily until he drew it back, shaking his head slightly, not in anger, but with quiet authority. Too much too fast would do her no good. Clara lay back, the taste of water lingering on her tongue like a blessing. She wanted to thank him, but her throat felt too raw for more words. The man turned his attention to her ankle. He had already removed her boot, Her stocking rolled down to reveal the swelling. Around the bite, the skin was discolored angry red at the edges, darkening toward the punctures. She braced herself, expecting pain, but his hands were precise and deliberate, avoiding unnecessary pressure. From his bundle, he selected a handful of leaves and crushed them between his fingers, releasing a pungent, almost bitter scent. He pressed the mash directly onto the wound, binding it in place with a strip torn from what looked like an older piece of cloth. The whole time, he said nothing. Not a murmur, not even a sigh. In the silence, Clara studied him. There was no trace of the hurried movements she'd seen in other men when someone was hurt. He did not panic, nor did he waste time. Every action seemed considered, like a man used to tending wounds alone. Far from any doctor. She wanted to ask who he was, why he'd stopped, what he planned to do with her now, but her voice had faded again, and the exhaustion pressing at her skull was too heavy to resist. Before she drifted back into the shadows, she felt the faintest tug of the cloth around her ankle, then the solid, steady presence of him lifting her effortlessly, as though she weighed nothing at all. Her last glimpse before the darkness came was of the horizon, shifting as he began to carry her not toward the east, where Charles had gone, but into the wild and trackless west. Clara floated in and out of awareness, her senses catching fragments of the world around her cool shade overhead, the smell of damp earth, the sound of trickling water somewhere nearby. When she opened her eyes fully, she was lying on a bed of soft pine needles. The searing heat of the desert was gone, replaced by a muted green light filtering through the branches of tall trees. Somewhere above, the wind moved gently, sighing through the canopy. The stranger was there, kneeling beside a small fire that crackled quietly. A clay pot rested in the coals, steam curling from its rim. He didn't look up at her awakening, but his hands worked steadily, stirring the contents with a carved wooden stick. Clara turned her head slightly, wincing at the pull in her neck. Her leg throbbed, a heavy, dull pain now, less sharp than before, but insistent. The swelling was still there, and the skin around the bite looked stretched and bruised. The stranger had rewrapped it with fresh cloth, the herb mash beneath giving off a pungent scent that prickled her nose. She tried to speak, but her voice was so faint she wasn't sure he heard. Where? He finally glanced at her, just a brief, assessing look before turning back to the pot. He didn't answer. Instead, he lifted the pot from the fire, set it on the ground, and began ladling the liquid into a small, chipped cup. He brought it to her, kneeling so their eyes were level. His expression was calm but unyielding as he held the cup to her lips. The liquid was bitter, earthy, and slightly metallic, and she nearly gagged. But his steady hand didn't move until she swallowed. When she managed it, he gave the smallest nod and set the cup aside. For a moment, neither spoke. Clara realized he hadn't said a single word since she'd first seen him, if he even spoke her language at all. Yet everything he did carried intention. The careful way he moved her leg, the methodical preparation of the herbs, the measured sips of water he allowed her. He turned back to his bundle of plants, selecting a fresh handful of narrow leaves and grinding them with a stone against a flat piece of wood. His movements were rhythmic, almost meditative. She watched the muscles in his forearms shift under his skin as he worked, each motion precise. The smell that rose from the crushed leaves was sharp and cooling, like mint but wilder. He pressed the new mash against the bite, replacing the earlier poultice, and bound it again with clean strips of cloth. When he finished, he reached into a small pouch at his belt and drew out something that gleamed in the shifting light, a bone needle, its point fine and polished. Clara's pulse quickened, but he didn't touch her with it. Instead, he used it to carefully score the skin around the swelling, not deep enough to cause bleeding, but enough to open the pores. From another pouch, he produced a fine gray powder. He sprinkled it sparingly over the scored skin, then rubbed it gently in with the flat of his hand. The sensation was cool at first, then tingled sharply before fading to a faint numbness. The whole process was done in silence. The only sounds the whisper of leaves overhead and the muted crackle of the key al audio. Fire. Clara found herself focusing on those sounds, letting them anchor her against the pull of exhaustion. At last, he sat back on his heels, studying her face as though gauging whether the treatment had taken hold. She met his gaze, searching for some flicker of intent, but his eyes were as unreadable as the desert stones. Her head felt heavy again, but she forced herself to stay awake long enough to ask, "Why?" "Help me?" His gaze didn't waver. After a long moment, he tapped his chest once, then hers, then gestured toward the trees around them, an unspoken connection, a sign she didn't fully understand but felt deep in her bones. Then he rose and moved to tend the fire, leaving her to drift again into the strange, dreamlike haze where the sound of the wind in the pines mixed with distant memories of home. The bitterness of the tea still lingered on her tongue. The warmth of it in her stomach spread slowly outward, pushing back against the cold tendrils that had crept through her veins since the bite. The venom wasn't gone, but for the first time since Charles left her in the sand, she felt its advance slowing. Somewhere in her fading thoughts, she realized the stranger was fighting for her life as fiercely as if it were his own. And he hadn't spoken a single word. When Clara woke again, the world was in motion. Her cheek rested against a solid surface that rose and fell with the rhythm of breathing. The sway beneath her was slow, measured. At first she thought she was on horseback, but there was no jolt of hooves, no creak of saddle leather. Then she understood. He was carrying her. Her arms were draped loosely over his shoulders, her legs supported by his forearms. She could feel the corded strength in his muscles, the steady beat of his heart against her side. Each step was deliberate, as though he knew exactly where to place his feet to avoid rocks, roots, and sound. They were no longer in the pine grove. Shadows stretched long across the ground, cast by mesquite and tall, jagged boulders. The air had cooled, carrying the dry scent of sagebrush. The sun was a molten sliver on the horizon, painting the desert in shades of copper and deep violet. Clara let her head turn slightly. Behind them, the land fell away into an open basin where heat shimmer still rose faintly from the earth. Ahead, the ground climbed toward a ridge marked with ancient, wind-carved stone. The stranger's breathing stayed calm, unlabored, even under her weight. He didn't speak, but occasionally his eyes flicked to the side, scanning the landscape with a predator's caution. The quiet wasn't empty, it was layered. The faint rustle of his steps through sand, the far-off cry of a night bird, the whisper of wind curling around the rocks. Every sound felt sharper, clearer. In this suspended space between day and night, her ankle still ached, but the pain had changed less of the searing heat from before, more of a deep, pulsing soreness. She wondered how far he meant to take her, and whether his silence meant he didn't know her language, or simply didn't trust her enough to use his words. Yet as twilight deepened, he paused briefly in the shelter of an outcrop. Setting her down gently against the warm rock, he crouched beside her and opened a small pouch at his belt. He handed her a strip of dried meat, tough but rich with salt, and tilted his water skin for her to drink a measured swallow. When she tried to hand the strip back, shaking her head, his gaze sharpened slightly, and he pushed it into her palm again. It was not a request. She took a bite. The pause lasted only long enough for the first stars to appear. Then he lifted her again, his arms firm, and resumed the climb toward the ridge. The moon was rising now, pale and thin against a velvet sky. Somewhere deep in the haze of her mind, Clara realized she trusted his movements more than she'd trusted Charles in months. The thought startled her, and yet Here in his arms, moving through the desert night, she felt a strange, fragile safety, the ridge leveled into a narrow plateau scattered with boulders and the twisted silhouettes of juniper trees. He carried her to a shallow cave, its mouth hidden in shadow, and set her down on a bed of dry grass and woven blankets. The air inside was cooler, still carrying a trace of warmth from the day's sun. Without ceremony, he began to prepare the SECERT. Space stacking a small fire, arranging stones to block the wind, laying his bundle of herbs within easy reach. The moonlight caught the edge of his face as he worked, and she thought she saw a faint scar along his jawline, like an old knife mark. When the fire was lit, its glow softened the cave's edges, turning the rough stone walls into a warm cocoon. Against the darkness outside, the stranger glanced at her once more, his gaze searching but unreadable, then stepped to the mouth of the cave to look out over the land below. Clara lay back against the blankets, the steady crackle of the fire in her ears. The venom still worked inside her, but slower now, dulled by his treatments. The journey through the shadows had ended here for the night, but she could feel, with a certainty she couldn't explain, that when morning came, he would carry her further into the unknown. The fire burned low, casting a restless dance of shadows across the cave walls. Outside, the wind moved in soft sighs, carrying the faint smell of juniper and the far-off howl of a coyote. Clara lay half-sitting against the blankets, her leg propped on a rolled hide. The throbbing in her ankle had eased to a dull, steady ache. The herbs he had packed around the bite gave off their sharp, medicinal scent, mixing with the smoky tang of the fire. The stranger sat near the entrance, his back to the cave, silhouetted against the starlit desert. His posture was that of a man accustomed to watching, not just for danger, but for changes in the land itself. He held a long, slender stick in his hands, whittling it slowly with a small, curved blade. The steady scrape of the knife was the only sound besides the fire's crackle. For a while, Clara thought he might remain silent all night, as he had since finding her. But then, without turning, he spoke, his voice low, deep, and carrying the cadence of someone who spoke English rarely, but with purpose when he did. "My name is Dakota." The syllables hung in the warm air, simple but weighted. Clara let the name settle in her mind before answering. Clara. Her own voice sounded strange to her ears, hoarse from thirst and disuse. He nodded slightly, as though committing it to memory. Minutes passed before he spoke again, and when he did, it wasn't a question. "Your man left you." Her jaw tightened. Yes. There was no pity in his tone, only statement, as if he had seen such things before. "A man who leaves in the desert," he said, "does not mean to come back." Clara looked at the fire, unwilling to meet his gaze. "I know." The scraping of his knife paused. "I have seen it," he continued. "A wagon train that left the old, the sick. My family among them. We buried them in the sand before the sun was high." The words were quiet, but they struck with the weight of stones. Clara turned her head toward him, searching his profile in the shifting firelight. "I was away hunting," he said simply. "When I came back." His voice faded, but the silence that followed told the rest. For a long while, neither spoke. Clara's mind turned over the image, Dakota returning to an empty camp, the ground freshly disturbed where his family had been left. When he finally looked at her, his gaze was steady, unreadable, but not cold. "I saw you, and I remembered," he said. "You were not yet gone, so I carried you." Clara swallowed hard. The bitterness of Charles's betrayal rose in her chest again, but it was joined now by something else, an unsteady gratitude for this man whose reasons for saving her went beyond obligation or chance. The fire popped softly, and Dakota returned to his whittling. Clara watched his hands, the same hands that had pulled her from the dust, that had bound her wound with precision and care. They moved with the certainty of someone who had learned to survive by his own skill without reliance on anyone else. At length, Dakota rose and stepped outside, scanning the horizon. His shadow stretched long into the moonlight. When he came back, he placed another log on the fire and settled across from her. "Rest," he said, his voice a quiet command. "The trail will be long." She nodded, though her thoughts were still tangled. She didn't know where he meant to take her, or why she trusted that he would see her safely there. But his words, few as they were, had reached her more deeply than anything Charles had said in months. As her eyes closed, the last thing she heard was the faint scrape of his knife again, steady and sure, as if shaping the wood was part of shaping the night itself. The next day began in a wash of pale gold light spilling into the cave. Clara woke to the smell of smoke and the faint crackle of the fire banked low but still alive. Her leg felt heavy, stiff, but the burning had eased. Dakota was already gone from the mouth of the cave. She could hear the faint rustle of movement. Outside, dry grass, soft footfalls, the sound of a bowstring being tested. When he returned, he carried a rabbit strung by its hind legs, its fur matted with dew. He moved without hurry, skin glistening faintly with the cool sweat of morning work. He crouched near the fire, drawing his knife in one smooth motion. The sound of steel against bone was so quiet, Clara almost didn't hear it over the wind. She tried to focus on the task, to let it anchor her mind against the unease that had begun to creep in since dawn. Something in the air felt wrong. Dakota seemed to sense it too. His eyes flicked toward the ridge beyond the cave, his movements slowing. Then, without a word, he laid the rabbit aside and rose, crossing silently to the shadows at the cave mouth. The stillness that followed was almost suffocating. Clara held her breath, straining to hear what he heard. At first, nothing, just the whisper of wind through mesquite. Then it came, the faint, uneven rhythm of HOOFBEATS. Her stomach dropped. The rider appeared slowly over the rise, a dark silhouette against the sunlit plain. The horse was familiar deep chestnut with a white blaze across its muzzle. And then she saw him. Charles. Even from a distance, she recognized the rigid line of his shoulders, the stiff-backed way he sat the saddle. He rode at a steady pace, scanning the land as if expecting trouble but not hurrying to avoid it. Dakota didn't move. He stood with one hand on the stone at the cave's edge, his gaze fixed on the rider. There was no visible tension in him, but Clara sensed it in the way his chest stilled, his breath slowing. When Charles drew nearer, she could see more the dust on his clothes, the pistol at his hip, the squint in his eyes as he surveyed the ridge. His face held no trace of guilt, only the calculating expression she knew too well. He stopped his horse at the base of the slope, looking up toward the cave. His gaze landed on her. "Clara," he called, his voice carrying sharp and clear. "You're alive." The words fell heavy with something that was not relief. Dakota shifted slightly, just enough to stand fully between her and the sunlight where Charles sat. Clara realized he was positioning himself, shielding her from view, though Charles had already seen her. "I came back," Charles said, as if the statement might erase what had happened. "Got turned around in the basin, lost a day's ride." Clara's throat tightened. She said nothing. Dakota still hadn't spoken. He stepped forward, down the slope a few paces, his shadow stretching long in the morning light. Charles's eyes flicked over him, narrowing at the sight of the bow and knife, then back to Clara. "You've made friends," Charles said, the corner of his mouth twisting not quite a smile. "Let's talk, Clara, you and me." The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of juniper between them. Clara felt the air tighten, as though the desert itself were holding its breath. Dakota didn't turn. His voice, when it came, was low and steady. "She stays." It was the first time she had heard him speak to another person, and the sound of it landed like a stone dropped into still water, quiet, but impossible to ignore. Charles's gaze hardened. His hand settled lightly on the pistol at his hip. Morning had turned, sharp and dangerous, and Clara knew the desert was about to decide whether it would keep her or take her back. The light on the ridge sharpened as the sun lifted higher, painting every shadow in stark contrast. The air between the three of them felt brittle, as though the wrong word might shatter it. Dakota stood on the slope, balanced and still, his bow unstrung but close at hand. Charles remained in the saddle below, one hand on the reins, the other resting lazily but not carelessly near his pistol. "Clara," Charles called again, his tone shifting from mock cordial to clipped. "I didn't ride all this way to have a stranger tell me where my wife stays." Dakota didn't move. "You left her," he said, voice even, almost quiet. "That makes her yours no longer." Charles's face darkened. "You don't know what you're talking about, Injun." He spat the word like a burr. "She's my responsibility. My property." The word landed in Clara's gut like a hot coal. She remembered the dry taste of dust when he rode away, the water skin bouncing from his saddle as she lay in the sand. Whatever part of her had clung to the hope of his return burned away in that moment. "I'm not your property," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected, carrying over the slope. Charles's gaze snapped to her. "You don't mean that. You're confused. Snakebite fever. You'll come down and we'll get back on the trail." "No." The single word seemed to hang in the air longer than it should. Charles shifted in the saddle, his posture hardening. "You'd choose him?" Dakota's eyes never left Charles, but Clara could feel his attention on her, waiting not for permission, but for clarity. She thought of the past few days, the quiet steadiness, the careful hands binding her wound, the long walk through the night sky's silence. She compared it to the man before her now, who had weighed her life against the inconvenience of slowing down. "Yes," she said, the word cutting cleaner than she expected. Charles's hand moved toward his pistol, slow but deliberate. Dakota stepped forward a single pace, and the shift in his stance was enough to change the air predator's focus, tightening on prey. The moment stretched, a taut line between them. Then Charles's eyes flicked between them both, calculating, and he eased his hand away from the gun. "This isn't over," he said, but there was no conviction behind it. With a tug of the reins, he wheeled the chestnut around, riding back. The way he had come, the hoofbeats faded into the desert's hum. Dakota didn't move until the sound was gone. Only then did he glance at Clara, his gaze holding hers for a long, unreadable moment before he turned back toward the cave. It felt less like a victory than a boundary drawn, and one that would hold. The desert was quiet again. The kind of quiet that feels like it belongs to something ancient, older than betrayal, older than survival, older even than memory. Clara sat just inside the cave, the morning light creeping across the stone floor. Her legs still ached, but she could stand now. The swelling had gone down, the herbs and strange teas having done their work. Dakota returned from the ridge with a measured stride, carrying his bow slung across his back. He didn't mention Charles, didn't need to. Whatever had just passed between them was finished. She rose slowly, testing her weight on the injured leg. He watched without offering his hand, not out of indifference, but as though letting her find her own balance was part of the healing. When she steadied, he gave the smallest nod. They ate in silence dried meat, water from a nearby spring. The sky was wide and clear, the heat of the day still hours away, when Dakota began to pack his bundle, wrapping herbs, tightening straps. On the waterskin, Clara felt the question hanging between them. He looked at her once, not asking with words, but with a faint lift of his chin. "Will you walk with me?" Clara stepped forward. "Yes." No hesitation, no backward glance. She left behind the cave, the ridge, and the faint hoof prints that marked where Charles had come and gone. Each step into the open desert felt lighter than the last, as if the sun overhead was burning away the remnants of the life she'd been abandoned to die in. Dakota set an easy pace, neither hurrying nor slowing for her. She matched him stride for stride, her skirt brushing against sage and wild grass. The land rolled out before them in shades of gold and rust, endless and untamed. They didn't speak, but it wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of two people moving in the same direction. For reasons they both understood without saying aloud. By midday, the ridge was only a jagged line on the horizon behind them. Ahead, the desert shimmered with heat, hiding whatever lay beyond. Clara didn't need to see it to know it was hers to claim. Somewhere in the vast emptiness, a hawk cried, wheeling high above. She lifted her face to the sound and kept walking, leaving the past in the sand.